You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Now, just a few little things before we transfer to the community radio network in a few minutes. The sacred cows are with us. They're on strike. Why are they on strike? They said, why do you call it the Sacred Cow Slaughterhouse, the Anarchist World this week? Good point. Now, the Radiothon. This is the final total. That's it till 2026. I'd like to thank all those people who donated to the 3CR Radiothon, courtesy of the Anarchist World this week. We raised $12,602... I'll start again. Not used to these large sums. $12,612.53. Don't ask me where the 53 cents came from, or even the $12.53. But it's all money. It all helps. It'll keep 3CR on air for another year. And if you and I are still alive next year for the next Radiothon, it'll mean that you'll continue to be able to listen to the Anarchist World this week. Now, this evening, which I assume is the 9th of July in the year of our Lords, 2025, is the dinner for all our listeners. Whether you're Pipsy members or not is irrelevant. For all our listeners, that's public interest before corporate interests. It'll be at the Neruda Cafe restaurant at the corner of Albion Street and Breeze, B-R-E-A-Z-E, Street in Brunswick, starting at 6:30 p.m. You're all welcome. There's only one problem. You've got to pay for your own food and drinks, which is, well, that's up to you. So hopefully a few people turn up for interesting conversations, or maybe even boring conversations. But the important thing is it's an interaction between real people in a real environment. No more of this Zoom and virtual garbage. For our listeners to the Anarchist World this week. Now, I'd like also to remind you that Solidarity Breakfast, 3CR Solidarity Breakfast, is having a Radiothon fundraiser, raffle and live gig extravaganza featuring live musical acts. That's interesting. Lots of raffle prizes from tattoo vouchers. To haircuts, and more. $10 entry at the door includes one raffle ticket. Now, it's at the Greek Democritus Workers' League Club, Greek Democritus Workers' League, 583 High Street, Northcote. 583 High Street, Northcote, this Saturday, the 12th of July, starting at 3 p.m. That's right, 3 p.m. So that's something else you can do. Isn't that amazing? And next week, if you're bored out of your mind, and next week will be midwinter, exactly, it'll be the 16th. That's 7 and 9 or 16, I think, yes. 16th, we'll be doing our presentation at the Footscray Hotel at 48 Hopkins Street, 6:30 p.m. for a 7 p.m. start. And guess what the topic will be? The rise and fall of the Australian division of the industrial workers of the world. Here we go. The satellite is upon us. We're about to be blasted off into the stratosphere. Oh my God, it's one of them. Welcome to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name's Joseph Toscano. Happy to take nice calls. Leave a message on 0439 395 489. Many other things you can do, but let's get stuck into the program. What is anarchy? Well, is it chaos? Unfortunately, it's not. You know, I'd like to be involved in a chaotic movement, but it's not. Anarchism is about organisation. I know it sounds, it doesn't make sense, but it's very simple. The word N.A.I.D.O.C means without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve, share power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. What extraordinarily lovely little concepts. And everybody thinks it's everything else. Isn't that amazing? They think that we're born with original sin, and if we don't have rulers to dictate how we live, what we do, that we're incapable of governing ourselves. That if there were no rulers, there'd be rape, pillage, murder. But that's what I see today. Rape, pillage and murder, and all those rulers out there enjoying themselves. But that's a different story. Now let's look at the world today. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard the term beyond the pale. It comes from the Latin, which means pointed stick, latus, which means pointed stick. And there are many explanations for that term beyond the pale, but it basically means that people, ideas, cultures that are just not worth even thinking about. And that's the problem here in the anarchist world this week. We raise a number of ideas every week, but most of them are considered to be beyond the pale. That's right, beyond the pale. They're considered to be ineffective, unworkable, not even worth looking at. And that's the problem with 21st century society. I mean, I can go on the virtual world and find out everything about nothing in the next 2 or 3 minutes if I could be bothered. But the fact is, in our society, there are ideas, actions, which are not worth considering because they're considered to be beyond the pale, beyond understanding. Not civilised, not appropriate, not the type of thing that nice people think about. See, but the problem is that we've reached such a stage in 21st century life, especially in the Western world, that we hug, that's right, hug a minuscule number of ideas. I mean, it's very easy to denigrate people with religious beliefs. But the fact is that the beliefs that form the cornerstone, the pillars, the foundation stone of our society are exceptionally limited. And anything else is just considered to be beyond the pale. So when we talk about holding wealth in common, people think, well, that's beyond the pale. It's not something we should be considering. Why should we consider it? When we talk about devolving or sharing power, again, these are concepts which are totally alien to the way we live and think. And to a significant degree, this has occurred not because of just politics or economics. It's about culture. It's about the type of culture that we accept as normal. The type of interactions we have every day with everybody on the planet. Unfortunately, many of us have no interactions with anybody for days on end. Now, that's the beauty of living in a city of, 5 or 6 million people. But it's those interactions. And all the interactions that we're involved in on a day-to-day basis are basically based on economic principles which reward a minority and penalise the majority. That's why we have billionaires. I was thinking to myself today, I was going to take a ride into space, but then I thought, the trouble is, I'd want to go to space for a little bit of solitude, but the trouble is there are so many billionaires up there these days that I wouldn't feel comfortable, so I've given that idea up this morning. But that's a different story. So everything that we talk about on this program is possible. It's possible because human beings are capable of organising themselves in a myriad of ways. But the essential ingredient is to be engaged, not just to be a consumer of information, a consumer of goods, a consumer of products, but to be engaged in the society and the situations you find yourself in. Because democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. If we believe that our only political responsibility is to cast a ballot every 3 to 4 years, we will continue to be bitterly disappointed, irrespective of who's elected into government. Because if we believe this is all we need to do, we will continue to see legislation passed through Parliament which benefits the 1% that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who have the disposable income to be involved in investments in this country. And that will continue ad nauseum. Change comes from direct action. Obviously, as activists, we use every legal option available to us to promote the ideas that we can run our own societies, that we don't need rulers, that we don't need hierarchy. But it means engagement. It means talking. It means being involved. And if you're not willing to do that, then we will continue to see Royal Commission after Royal Commission, coroner's report after coroner's report, investigation after investigation, gather dust on parliamentary shelves across this country. And if there's one thing I want you to take from the Anarchist World this week, is the fact that it's engagement, your engagement, which acts as the catalyst for change. Without your engagement, nothing changes. And by leaving it to a vanguard or a political party to do that work for you, you will continue to be bitterly disappointed with the results. That's the sermon for the day. Engagement. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting. You can kill 60,000 people, the majority of them women and children. You can reduce a enclave of 2 million people to rubble. You can deny people medical care. You can starve a population. And it's acceptable. We don't hear much from the corporate-owned media or the government-gelded ABC or our political leaders or corporate leaders regarding the atrocities and the carnage that's occurring in Gaza, and more importantly, the reasons for it. But when we see some action that occurs which plays into the hands of the Israeli state, as we've seen, in Australia in the last few days, we have prime ministers commenting, we have opposition leaders carrying on, we have shock jocks, giving us the usual rave. We have the corporate-owned media telling us the end of the world is nigh, and that it's not going. But the thing is, this is what occurs. These type of actions we've seen just play into the Israeli state's hands. But to me, it's the hypocrisy. It's the fact that once something happens, Australian society is aghast. Something else happens which is beyond our imagination, and we ignore it. I mean, if somebody turns off the power on your house or unit or whatever you live in for 24 hours, you think it's the end of the earth. Well, obviously it's not the end of the earth. But if you look at what people in Gaza have suffered over the last 20 months, you begin to understand the enormity of the situation, the hypocrisy of the Western world. And this has been played out for us in the last few days. That's what we've been seeing. So the thing is, don't play into the Israeli state's hands. If you're thinking of things, don't think about it. What changes things is increasing pressure, not isolated individual acts. Because isolated individual acts can be constrained, and more importantly, they can be used to promote the atrocities that continue to be played out in Gaza as I speak. Let's move on. Now, I've got an idea for a musical, but I'm going to need some help because, I hate music, you know that. And I was thinking of calling the musical War Criminal Nominates Buffoon for Nobel Peace Prize. What do you reckon? In front of the major theatre in your capital city. I mean, we've had Urinetown. Why can't we have War Criminal Nominates Buffoon for Nobel Peace Prize? I mean, sometimes I think, where am I living? Is it this some parallel universe? Here we have a war criminal, Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, goes off to see his little mate who helped him, bomb nuclear facilities in Iran because they didn't have the technology in Israel, to negotiate, in inverted commas, a peace plan for Gaza. Right? Now, this man's a war criminal. The Israeli state is a pariah state. It's no different to Iran. It's a pariah state. We have a war criminal nominating the buffoon, the President of the United States of America, for our Nobel Peace Prize. Now, you may not remember who Mr. Nobel was. Well, Mr. Nobel was the inventor of dynamite. Yep, dynamite. Obviously, dynamite is nothing in comparison to a neutron bomb. Dynamite. And his widow was so shocked by the damage caused by that invention that the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Prizes were established. And you got Nobel Prizes for literature, peace, science, mathematics, physics, astronomy, I think, and the list goes on and on. To honour people who've done something significant to promote the health of the human race. Now, a war criminal nominating a buffoon for the Nobel Peace Prize, to me, is nothing short of a comedy act. And obviously Netanyahu thinks that if he greases up the buffoon in Washington, that somehow they'll get some type of peace plan in Gaza which will involve the displacement, the ethnic cleansing of the Gazans from Gaza so they can actually build some nice apartments, for tourists to enjoy the ocean, the Venice of the Middle East. Not the Lido, I should say, of the Middle East. So I want to do a musical So if there's anybody out there who's interested, give me a call. 0439 395 489. I'm sure it would be a hit. Extraordinary. Just extraordinary when you think about it. The whole thing is just extraordinary. Now let's move on. I was interested, was it the big, fat, beautiful bill or something that the Republicans have passed in the United States of America? And I'm thinking, when the Depression occurred, Roosevelt introduced the New Deal. The New Deal for the people of America. And the New Deal was about ensuring that a few more crumbs were brushed off the corporate table to look after the interests of workers and the unemployed in the United States of America, the land of the brave and the free. Now, what we've seen in the last few days is the reintroduction of the old deal. And I'm really wondering how those voters who voted for Mr. Trump and the Republicans are feeling today. I mean, it's a wonderful bill if you're a billionaire, and even if you're a millionaire, because you will get significant tax cuts. But if you find yourself at the pointy end of life, it's an extraordinarily harsh, cynical bill. So let's get back to the 1920s and the 1930s. This was the heyday of the American trade union movement, the heyday of the industrial workers of the world, when action at the point of production was able to create the climate for significant changes and the introduction of the New Deal. The New Deal didn't come out of anywhere. The New Deal came from the realisation that Americans were on the verge of revolting. Not that they were revolting, but they were on the verge of revolt. So let's see what the reintroduction of the old deal does. Do Americans still hang on every word coming from the mouth of the buffoon? Or those that are disgusted, not just by the Republican Party, but the Democrats, get involved in a bit more direct action? Let's see what happens. Because the reality is that what we are seeing in the U.S.A. is nothing more than a seizure of power. A seizure of power by that minuscule minority that continues to dominate every aspect of existence, not just in the United States of America, but in good old Australia. New Deal, old deal, old deal, new deal. So what am I going to do about it? Well, I've made a few decisions over the years. One, and these are things you can do if you want to. You don't have to, but it's up, Considering that the American pharmaceutical corporate sector has convinced the buffoon and his mates to kind of introduce some extraordinary tariffs because we have a socialised, do you like that word? Socialised pharmaceutical benefit scheme. What does that mean? What is a socialised pharmaceutical benefit scheme? That means that if you go to the pharmacy and you've got an issue, over 900 products are subsidised by the Australian government. And we are now seeing an attempt by the United States government to introduce tariffs against Australian pharmaceuticals because we are not dancing to their tune. We are having an impact on their bottom line as if American pharmaceutical corporations, need more profits. So we're going to get punished. And we can see our government going, oh no, we'll have to negotiate. Touch, touch. I mean, this is a cornerstone of Australian society. It didn't appear overnight. It appeared after years and years and years of struggle to ensure that every Australian had access to essential medications and they weren't inhibited from acquiring those essential medications because they didn't have the cash in their pockets to buy it at the point of distribution of the pharmacy. For example, I'll give you an example. Those of you who have COVID, who fit the criteria, may have got an antiviral. Now, if you're on some type of social security benefit, you'd pay about $6.90, $7.50 for that antiviral. If you're not, you'd pay about $32. Well, the cost of those, 40 tablets, the cost to the government is $1,105.67. So what the pharmaceutical benefit scheme does is actually subsidise that. Now, there are new expensive medication which are now currently being subsidised, including cancer treatments, including treatments for respiratory disease, and the list goes on and on, which no individual, apart from a few millionaires and billionaires, would actually be able to access. We're talking about $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 a year, sometimes more. And that is subsidised through the taxation system. So the American pharmaceutical corporations say to their president, the buffoon in the White House, they say, Mr. Bufalini, it's unfair competition. Unfair competition. You need to do something about this. It's socialised medicine. As if socialised medicine is some type of fatal disease. So let's put a spoke in their wheels. Let's introduce tariffs. Let's make it difficult for them to survive. Well, it's about time we put a spoke in their wheels, and you can do little things yourself. You know, we're not a great economy. There's only about 28 million people here on the continent, but you can do things like this. Don't take a holiday in the U.S.A. If you're going to have a holiday, why wait in some long line to be processed and then maybe chucked out? So you can have a big fat hamburger somewhere in the U.S.A. Just boycott them. People are already boycotting the USA. You want to go to Disneyland? Go to Disneyland in Japan. Go to Disneyland in Paris. It's all the same. Don't go to the USA. That's one little thing you can do. Also, there are products made in the USA. Look at where the product is made. Don't buy it. You don't have to buy it yet. You're not forced to buy it. And I'm talking about not just products that you get on a shelf, but I'm talking about music, records, whatever. Television streaming services, music streaming services. They're owned by U.S.A. corporations. Don't subscribe. There are other streaming services you can access. Why pollute your mind with that garbage when you can pollute your mind with some other garbage? There are things you can do at an individual level. There are things you can do. And it doesn't take much sacrifice to do it. And if some United States Act comes to our shores, instead of fighting amongst ourselves to get our $1,000 tickets to sit somewhere near the front behind a row of, people holding up their phones, don't buy the shit. Tell them to go home. If they want to attack our pharmaceutical, it's ours. This is one thing that is ours, because it is subsidised by the taxpayer, and it benefits almost every single person on this continent, if they want to attack something which is fundamental to providing care for people in this country, well, then it's about time that we boycotted anything that smells of the U.S.A.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. You can go to the YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interests, josephtoscano.nam. If you're interested in Australian history, go to josephtoscano.nam. You can always go to Public Interests Before Corporate Interests. They're the website. I'm the registered officer of Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. You can join online and become part of a movement which puts the benefit or the survival of the many before the survival of the few. That small section that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. What else? You can go, there's plenty of stuff, plenty of stuff. You can podcast Radical Australia. You can access those podcasts. So there's a lot of stuff up there. It's really up to you, what you access and why you access it. But the important thing is engagement is the key. Engagement. Now, I'm sure most of you, not most of you, I assume some of you have been to South Australia, and we do have South Australia listeners. And those of you who are not in South Australia who are listening to this program may not realise that South Australia, Kangaroo Island, Florenet Peninsula, even the Adelaide beaches, are in for a torrid time because there's a toxic algae plague, if that's the word, toxic algae foam. Now, toxic algae is a little bit like an underwater fire. Now, when we have a fire on land, a bushfire, a significant bushfire, everything before that fire dies or is burnt. Obviously, things regenerate later on, but everything at that point in time is killed. That's a bushfire. Now, there is a toxic algae foam which I understand is almost as big or bigger than Kangaroo Island in South Australia. Huge, unparalleled, toxic foam that's killing everything, not just the animals and the clams and the mussels and the oysters and the other invertebrates, but is now killing the kelp and anything that's alive. Now, obviously, toxic algae is not a new issue. It's been around for a while. But we have seen an increase in toxic algae around this country in the last 2 or 3 decades, especially the last decade. And to a significant degree, this is due to warming oceans. But not just warming oceans. The problems with fertilisers being washed out to sea. So it's a significant issue. And I find it strange that we're happy as a nation for the federal government to declare a state of emergency, even state governments declare a state of emergency for a flood or a fire or a tornado. I think it's about time that we fought as a nation about declaring a state of emergency regarding this toxic algae bloom outside Adelaide, Kangaroo Island, the Florenet Peninsula. because the consequences are not just catastrophic, not just for the environment, but those people who rely on that environment for their living. And if you're interested in what toxic algae does, or if you're interested in what increased ocean temperatures mean, I suggest you look at the latest aerial pictures, which I'm sure you'll be able to find on the World Wide Web, of Lizard Island in far north Queensland. Now, Lizard Island is the type of luxury accommodation that we all would love to access. I think it's about $4,000 a night. But the trouble is, not the $4,000 a night. I'm sure you and I could afford that quite easily. Just pocket money for us. You know, that's why you listen to the Anarchist World this week, because you're a billionaire and you want to know how to make some more money. But the fact is that the bleaching that's occurred to the coral reefs around Flinders Island and many other parts of the Great Barrier Reef are unparalleled. Unparalleled. So when we see the Australian Labor Party, a government with an extraordinary majority and a friendly Senate, pass legislation to give Woodside Gas another 40 years lease to extract gas from northwest Australia, you begin to realise the extent of the issues that we face and the fact that we're actually not willing to take the climate emergency seriously. Now, I know it sounds melodramatic, but the fact is that nature does not care. It doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about the animals. It doesn't care about the plants. Nature is nature. And if we continue the way we're going, we will harvest the crop. And the crop is increasing climatic issues. And something we need to think about. Not only think about, but actually act on. And if there's one thing this toxic algae bloom in South Australia should alert us to, the fact is that these things can happen rapidly, unexpectedly. And unless we have some type of national authority which is established to deal with the increasing issues which are created by the climate emergency, we will be totally unprepared for the disasters, and I know it sounds melodramatic, that await us. The only good thing about being old is that I won't survive to see it. But, unfortunately, my children and grandchildren and your children and grandchildren and your friends who will survive will be the beneficiaries of our addiction to money, our greed. The fact is, we live in a society, as I keep talking about, based on one single principle. Creating increasing profits, irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. That is our mammon, that is our God. Consumerism, that is our God. We love to buy things. And while we continue to love to buy things for the sake of accumulating wealth, we will continue to be plagued by the problems that a climate emergency, and it is a climate emergency, pose. So there's two things you can look at. Far north Queensland, look at the aerial pictures regarding the dead corals regarding Lizard Island, which was considered to be the epitome of a tropical paradise. I think it had 6, I could be wrong here, I'm not into luxury travel. I think it had 6 luxury little units on the island, which they were renting out for $4,000 a night, and then go down to the Florinet Peninsula in South Australia and Kangaroo Island and have a look at the toxic algae bloom. And if you don't believe in the climate emergency, maybe you should start taking the science seriously. Let's move on. This week is N.A.I.D.O.C week. So what's N.A.I.D.O.C week? I'm sure 99%, well, I'll say 95% of people listening to this program have heard of N.A.I.D.O.C week, and I'm sure many of people have been involved in N.A.I.D.O.C week celebrations. Now, let's not forget that in 1938, on the 150th anniversary of the beginning of colonisation of Australia, there was a protest by Aboriginal people. And those of us who are old enough to remember 1988, the 200th anniversary of the colonisation of Australia, you'd see the large number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from around the country who came to Sydney to highlight that this country had a black history. Well, N.A.I.D.O.C week was established 50 years ago. I think this year is the 50th anniversary. So what does N.A.I.D.O.C stand for? It stands for the National, that's N, Aboriginal, that's A, and Islander, that's I, Day, that's D, of, Observation, that's O, Committee, that's C. So that's the abbreviation, N.A.I.D.O.C week, National Aboriginal and Islander Day of Observation Committee. Now, obviously, there are many community-focused and organised festivals and events during this week to highlight the importance of Aboriginal and Islander people on this planet and what they've done and what they continue to do. But unfortunately, we've seen some corporations now, jump onto the bandwagon. And it's an issue that people should think about. Now, obviously, I'm encouraging people to attend as many N.A.I.D.O.C week events in their part of the world as possible. But I think when you look at the events, look at the ones that are community-owned, community-controlled, and take part in them. And those that, you got the big corporate sponsors who have their names splashed everywhere, maybe, just maybe, you should think twice about it. You listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now, I'm interested in the concept of freedom. Not freedom to do what I like, but a freedom which is constrained by the needs and liberties of the people around me. And a lot of Australians have this misconception that we have constitutional freedoms. Freedoms which no political party which is in government can remove. Now, the Australian Constitution was occurred after a number of congresses in the 1890s and a number of referendums in the colonies which made up the Federation. And that's why we have a parliamentary system where the Senate numbers are equal for each state, irrespective of the population. For example, in Tasmania, the population is around 520,000. They have 12 senators. In New South Wales, where the population I think is about 7.5 million, maybe 8 million, they have 12 senators. The problem, in order to create the Federation, what we saw is a watering down of the content of the constitutional arrangements. And obviously we all know there's no mention of this country's First Nations people in the Constitution, and most people are aware of that. But just as importantly, there's minuscule references to freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, freedom of speech in the Australian Constitution. Now, I have just seen you fall over. So what are the 4 freedoms which are enshrined in the Australian Constitution? And are they the freedoms that you think you have? Well, you've got the freedom to a trial by jury for a major crime. You've got a freedom of religious expression. You have the right to fair compensation if your property or land is acquired by the federal government. And I like this one. You have the freedom not to be discriminated against, not because of your creed, not because of your colour, not because of your gender, not because of your sexual orientation, but because of the place you live. So I cannot discriminate constitutionally without, consequences. Somebody lives in New South Wales because that's the centre of all evil. All right? If I said that. You cannot have institutional discrimination based on the state you live in. And obviously in a federation that makes sense. Because obviously the people of New South Wales are a little bit hesitant to accept the losers in the other states into the the Australian Federation, and it took 2 referendums before they decided they wanted to federate with the other colonies. And the other states were a little bit concerned about the New South Wales, the uppity people in New South Wales, so they wanted that little section included in the Constitution. So, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of association, no freedom of speech. Things are so difficult that the High Court of Australia had to find an implied right to freedom of speech only during an election campaign, because you can't have an election without freedom of speech. So now that the election campaign is over, that freedom of speech has disappeared. So what that means is, and this is what people find difficult to understand, what that means is that a party with a political majority in both houses of Parliament and just a single majority in the Queensland Parliament, because there's no upper house, that was abolished, can pass almost any legislation they want to restrict protest, to restrict freedom of movement, to restrict freedom of speech. And over the last 20 years, we have seen increasing waves of legislation which restrict most of these liberties. And the greatest impact that has occurred is on the Australian trade union movement. Think about it. There are very few organisations in this country that were able or are able to provide resistance, effective resistance at the point of production in the workplace to the demands of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. So when we saw the construction division of the CFMEU put into, liquidation, whatever it was put into, you could, without any criminal charges being laid to date, you begin to understand the power that the central government has. See, a lot of people like to point to China and they say, look at the lack of freedom in China. Well, obviously there's lack of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but we need to look at it in our own backyard. Now, as far as your ability to freely associate on the workplace, it's non-existent. It is totally non-existent. we have seen over the last 3 decades legislation come into place which makes striking illegal in Australia. Obviously, you can withdraw your labour after you jump through a number of hoops during enterprise bargaining agreement period, which may occur every 3 to 4 years in your particular industry. But you don't have the right to withdraw your labour outside that period. And if you withdraw your labour outside that period, individual workers, and it has occurred in West Australia a number of years ago, individual workers can be fined up to $10,000 a day for withdrawing their labour. Now, in the good old days, in inverted commas, you would see trade unionists jailed repeatedly for being involved in strike action. But the fact that individual workers can now be fined up to $10,000 a day for withdrawing their labour, what that means is the people there who are dependent on that income are punished for the fact that somebody is involved in some type of activity to improve their particular work situation. This isn't communist China or North Korea or Putin's Russia. This is good old Australia. Then you have other legislation which people have conveniently forgotten. After the 7/11 disasters, Australian governments passed some of the most repressive legislation that has occurred anywhere in the Western world. Today, I think it's the Home Affairs Minister, used to be the Attorney General, but I think it's now the Home Affairs Minister, has the power, and I'm not making this up, has the power to ban any organisation they like at any time without going through Parliament, because he deems or she deems that they may pose a threat to Commonwealth property or interests. Remember that? Commonwealth property or interests. So, for example, if you're involved in a direct action campaign against Pine Gap, that organisation can be banned overnight. And if you continue to claim you're part of that organisation, you can be jailed for up to 25 years. Now, another popular way of protesting in the workplace in the 70s and 80s were workplace occupations, where workers would occupy their place of work to try to improve their situation. Today, under current legislation, you can be jailed for up to 25 years to be involved in an occupation. And when it comes to picket lines, you've got community pickets because workers aren't able to picket outside many of these situations they find themselves in, except after an enterprise bargaining agreement period. And you tell me that we live in a free society. Obviously, they want to channel everything into arbitration. So, think about it. Now, I don't want to harp on this, but there are laws in this country which are as draconian as any you would see in Iran. For example, if I'm walking down the street, right, I can be kidnapped legally by this country's social security agencies because they believe that I may have information that may assist them in their investigations in a particular group. Now, if I refuse to answer questions while I'm kidnapped, I can be kidnapped for up to 7 days, incognito. If I refuse to answer questions, I can be in jail for up to 5 years. And then after I'm released, if I'm released, and I tell anybody I've been kidnapped by this country's social security agencies, I can be jailed for up to 5 years. Isn't that extraordinary? I'm sure the Chinese Communist Party would love to have that law on its books. I'm sure they do. Legal kidnapping, because I may have information that may assist them in their inquiries. Extraordinary. And it has been used, and it will continue to be used. Because we do live in a society where power is concentrated in a fewer and fewer hands, and where wealth somehow is upwardly mobile, where the social elevator has been burnt to cinders. And in those situations, what you will see, as you will see in the United States and this country and other countries around the world, you will see increasing agitation from below. Initially, people look to the Trumps, the buffoons of the world, to help them out of the situation they find themselves in. But once they realise they've been stabbed in the back, we will see a re-emergence of direct action, not just on the streets, but at the point of production, in order to maximise our ability as a people to share in the wealth of this country. As I keep saying, this is not a poor country. 28 million people living on a resource-rich continent. Everybody in this country should be living the life of Riley. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because of inequalities in power and wealth. And if you think you're going to change this by casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years and then going in the virtual world, well, it doesn't happen. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. In case you've got nothing to do and you've given up your American streaming services, there are hundreds of podcasts of the Anarchist World this week you can listen to. You can go to the YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, over 350 25-minute broadcasts in the wonderful fresh air in the country regarding different issues, many of which are raised on the Anarchist World this week. So you don't have to rely on your American streaming services, to make your life bearable. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program has been coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. My name's Joseph Toscano. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, next week on your local community radio station.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.